For our next segment, we're excited to have Kelly Frawley with us. She is a partner in the Matrimonial and Family Law Department for Kazowitz Benson Torres LLP. I'm excited and also kind of sad to talk about Jeff Bezos' divorce, which has been making headlines lately, a lot of gossip, but we can learn something from it. Hi, Kelly.
Oh, how are you?
Good. Thank you for being here.
Oh, tough to follow that segment with all the upbeat news about where to travel.
Now we're going to take it to broken dreams and broken relationships.
That's where you would go on your honeymoon, or maybe after your divorce.
Like a divorce party.
Yes, a
depending
divorce
upon
party.
who you married and how horrible they were. You just didn't know yet. What aspects stand out for you from the Bezos divorce story?
You know, I think one of the first things is that how interested everybody is in it. You know, when Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt were divorcing, there was a lot of interest there. And I think they're both celebrities who we see in movies, and their relationship had started after, you know, the breakup with Brad and Jennifer. So that sort of made sense to me. And there was custody and salacious details of drug use and alcohol use. Here, the interest is just phenomenal. And I can't figure out if it's people want to see them sort of fail in their divorce, if they're concerned about their own shares of stock at Amazon. But people are very interested. So that has surprised me.
Well, it also could be that alleged extramarital affair where people start getting kind of hooked. Like, how did this long marriage fall apart, especially with so much money at stake? And what's interesting about the Bezos divorce is there was no prenup, because when they got married all those years ago, I guess he never realized he was going to become the richest man in America.
No. And in fact, I recently read that up until 2013, she was still driving him to work every day in their Honda, and then dropping off their kids to school. So I think their financial success is new. It's recent. But it makes sense that they didn't have a prenuptial agreement. They met in the workplace when they were working out here on the East Coast, and he had this idea to start Amazon, and they moved out to Seattle and lived a very modest lifestyle until, I think, very recently.
What can regular people learn from a high-profile divorce like this?
I think that it's important to be involved in your marriage, right? I mean, it's not necessarily that you would want to prepare for your divorce during your marriage, but it's play a role in it. You know, don't assume that your spouse is doing everything. I mean, here, Mackenzie was involved in some way in the business, and I'm not suggesting that if your spouse has a business, you have to work there necessarily, but be aware of what it is. Be aware of what the assets are. In that way, it makes it a little bit easier to enter into a settlement versus having to litigate a divorce. Because when you're at the very high end, like the Bezoses are, you want to keep your case out of court. You want to try to privately settle it. And what makes it easier to settle it is when you've been informed during the marriage.
Right. And sometimes you'll probably have to get like a forensics accountant, too, when you have that kind of money at stake, to find out, is your estranged spouse telling you the truth about their money? Do they have it offshore somewhere? We've seen really messy celebrity divorces in the past. Do you think that, especially for millennials, the idea of like hearing the word prenup sometimes seems like a slap in the face to your future spouse, being like, well, our marriage might not make it, so let's have something in place. Someone could say, well, hey, what about, being together for all eternity? What would you recommend to someone who's about to get hitched? So
we're seeing a lot, a strong uptick in divorce and prenuptial agreements for people who have nothing other than student loans. And what a lot of them come in and say is that my parents got divorced, and, I was a child of a really messy divorce, and I just don't want to have to deal with that. So to me, that makes sense. At a minimum, anybody who is thinking about getting engaged or is engaged to be married should meet with a matrimonial and family law attorney and find out what the laws are in their state if a divorce happens. And they may find, like as here in New York, the law is very protective of assets you bring into the marriage, assets you may inherit during the course of the marriage, where you don't need necessarily to have a prenuptial agreement. So I would just encourage people to become informed about the whole process. And I don't think anyone should be slighted if their partner wants to have a prenuptial agreement. I think it's how they approach it with their partner. You don't want to catch them off guard. I think it's a conversation that should be started before the engagement.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it might be a non-starter for the party who's not asking for the agreement.
And a prenup can also be more than just finances. You could have things in there that could protect even infidelities. I remember reading something, and this is obviously alleged, that Catherine Zeta-Jones, when she was getting married, said he had a history of philandering, and she wanted to make sure that it was in her prenup that if he cheated, she got X amount of dollars.
Right. So, and oftentimes, the focus of my practice is here in New York State. And oftentimes people will come in and they're always like, I want some type of punishment in there if he cheats on me or she cheats on me, or even worse, if she gains weight. What am I going to do then?
You have clients that ask that?
Yes.
Whoa.
And so
much I want to say.
I'm sure. But those aren't the types of clauses that New York State would enforce.
Right. That makes sense. In terms of a divorce like the Bezos, there's children involved. So how does that affect how a divorce would proceed?
It depends if everything I have read about this couple is that they are very respectful of one another. They want to have an amicable process. And, Jeff's tweet about their separation indicated that they actually they've had a trial separation. So it says to me that these are two people who can co-parent.
Right.
And are going to be able to work together, in terms of sharing parenting time and access with the kids and making big decisions for them.
How do you think that this will probably play out because they don't have a prenup?
I think amicably, if they had entered into a prenuptial agreement before Amazon even existed, they would probably not even be able to rely on it. It wouldn't have contemplated being the most the wealthiest couple in the world.
Yeah.
So it probably would have been a waste. Something that they could have considered was an agreement during the marriage, a postnuptial agreement. But maybe they did.
Right.
And maybe she just wasn't willing to, sign on to it. But, Mackenzie in her own right is very successful.
Right.
And, we can't, she's an author. And she also, it seems, based on what I've read, she's contributed a lot to the home. And, you can't build what you have built outside the home without having stability in the home. So I think it's important that, what she contributed is really given great weight.
That's an interesting thing that you mentioned about stability within the home, and without her providing that stable home life for him, he wouldn't have become so successful. So how does a lawyer monetize that kind of value when there is no number to, a lot of times when women are stay at home or whatever, they've contributed a lot to the marriage.
Absolutely.
So how do you monetize that?
Well, you figure out what it is that they've done, and you identify those as what we call indirect contributions to the accumulation of assets. And so, like here in New York, you usually assign a percentage to those assets that the non-titled spouse would receive, or the one who hasn't actually gone out and do the work to accumulate them. So here in New York, typically for a mid to long-term marriage, it's 50%. Sort of similar in Washington. I don't practice there, but what I have read, it seems to be a similar approach.
Very eye-opening, the business of marriage.
It really is. And, whenever I do a consultation for a prenuptial agreement, I'll have a young man who's very successful, who is engaged to be married to somebody who is nowhere near his level of success in the workplace. And he'll say, why should I give her anything? And I'll say, how do you think, the milk gets in the refrigerator, or, you have Windex to clean stuff in the house? Like, she contributes. And so it needs to be taken into account.
Sometimes I wonder if marriage is going to just become obsolete. At some point, because it's become so much about the finances, and it really is a business arrangement where you could just have a spiritual union and forget it all. Right? Yeah. But thank you for your time, and also for your insights. So interesting.